Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the upcoming Death Cross. Now, I know that is a bad name, but that is just what people call it. And so, just so everyone knows what we're talking about, it is the crossing of the 50-day SMA below the 200-day SMA. So, we're just going to be talking about it. We're going to be looking at what happened previously when it occurred and just take it from there. All right. So if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. One of the things we mentioned just a few days ago, put out a video on Monday, and I said that the most likely outcome is for Bitcoin to rally into the death cross. The reason for that is because oftentimes when you get a death cross, the price action to cause it already occurred because it's a lagging indicator, right? It's a moving average, it's a lagging indicator. And so people get fearful and then they hear the word death cross and then they sell because they hear that the death cross is coming up. And usually what happens is that Bitcoin rallies into the death cross. And we mentioned that back on Monday. Now, the death cross is just, again, it's when the 50-day SMA goes below the 200-day SMA. And if you zoom in here, you can see that it's about to occur, right? The 50-day SMA is about to go below the 200-day SMA. And once again, we are seeing Bitcoin rally into the death cross. This should not be a surprise. In fact, the same exact thing happened last year. If you go back and look at what happened in 2023 when Bitcoin had a death cross, what we said would likely happen was a sell-off into the death cross and then a rally once the death, sort of right as the death cross arrives. And that's exactly what we ended up getting, right? I mean, you can see that I think we put out a video back then called the Death Cross Rally. And you can see that Bitcoin ended up going up a lot. Now, admittedly, it went up a lot more than I thought it was at the time. I was forecasting for it to go up, but I didn't think it was going to immediately break up, to like 48K over the next few months. So it is important to recognize that typically what happens when a death cross arrives is you get this rally into it, right? What happens after that is obviously going to be up to ongoing developments in the larger market. But in the short term, golden crosses usually cause short term dumps, and death crosses usually are accompanied by those short term pumps. And because that's exactly what happened, right? And in fact, back then, Bitcoin rallied up to its 50-day SMA after the death cross occurred, right? You see that up to the 50-day SMA. For reference, right now, the 50-day SMA, I mean, it is going down. So the number I tell you is going to be different tomorrow. But right now, the 50-day SMA is at around $62,000. Okay, so if you see Bitcoin at 62K within the next couple of days, just remind yourself that is exactly the 50-day SMA. And in 2023, that's the level that ultimately provided some resistance for about a week or so. All right, about 50-day moving average, and that'd be just north of $60,000. Now, if you go back and you look at golden crosses, you'll see oftentimes that the reverse happens, right? You get dumps into golden crosses. You see that? You see here how there was a golden cross, and then you had a dump into the golden cross. Here you had a death cross, and then you had a rally into the death cross. And then if you go back even further and you look at this death cross, you'll see the same thing, right? There was a death cross, and then as the death cross arrived, then Bitcoin rallied. And it just plays out a lot, right? Here's another example in 2021, great example in 2021, where as the death cross arrived, Bitcoin was rallying into the death cross. You see that? And again, that's something that we see happen a lot. And that's why I said on Monday, let's get ahead of this. Back when Bitcoin was at like 50K, I said, let's get ahead of this, because what normally happens is that Bitcoin rallies into the death cross. Right? Now, we've made a lot of comparisons to 2019. And I'd like to think back at the beginning of this year, back in March, when Bitcoin was trading at 73K, and I said, look, guys, USDT dominance is at 4%. This is kind of a big level. And a lot of times there are larger corrections when this happens. And here we are, right? I'd like to think that the 2019 comparison has played out pretty well, even though it seemed like back in March, everyone was against it. And yet here we are, half a year later, basically, and you can see that that's what happened, right? You had a series of lower highs and lower lows. And it was crazy because even this recent high back at the conference, I was meeting with a lot of people, and it seems like no one was on board with the idea of another lower low. And then shortly thereafter, we got another lower low. So what I want to do, because the 2019 comparison has played out so well, I'd like to look at what happened in 2019, right? Now, arguably, we've already completed the pattern, right? We've already completed the pattern. What I mean by that is that Bitcoin, has already had a low and then this lower low, right? Same thing over here, right? So you sort of set this up. You can see this low. Bitcoin had this low right here, and then a lower low, and then a lower low, right? Same thing. You had your first low, a lower low, and then a lower low. So you could argue that that part of the fractal has already played out. And of course, what comes next could just be whether we engineered a soft landing, if the Fed engineered a soft landing, or if you get a hard landing. But let's not look at it like that for the purposes of this video. Let's just say, okay, we know that the 2019 comparison, despite the critics, right, despite the critics, has been the most valuable. And in fact, anyone who is looking at the 2019 comparison because of monetary policy, they're a step ahead, I think, of people that have not and that thought that monetary policy was useless in understanding market movements in the cryptoverse. So all I really want to look at right now is what happened in 2019 when you had the death cross. And what you'll notice is that Bitcoin also rallied into it. And in fact, on the day of the death cross, it put in a local top that held as the top for a couple months, or no, more than a couple months, right? More than a couple months. I'm not suggesting that that has to happen this time, right? But this was in October, and then it came back up to that level in February, right? So November, December, January, February. You had 4 months in between. So that's also something that you should have on your radar. And of course, there's other examples of death crosses. We had a death cross back over here in 2015, where that 50-day SMA ultimately fell below the 200-day SMA, and you can see that the market rallied after it, and then it went up quite a bit. So it's important to look at all of them, right? It's important to look at all of them, but this is why I said on Monday, like, let's get ahead of this, because I knew that if I waited until today and said it, people would have been like, well, you're only saying it now. But that's why we said it on Monday, right? That this is what normally happens, is that you get a rally into the death cross. And because the death cross makes headlines, people freak out, they sell, they get left behind, the market goes up, they panic buy back in as it's going up, and then the market cools off again, right? And that's actually what happened in 2019, right? You can see a pretty strong rally into the death cross, and then it faded. And also in 2023, in fact, pretty strong rally right after the death cross, and then it faded for a little bit, and then we got into the spot ETF hype, and then the market went up. And then that's why I say, and I talked about this back then too, just because you get a death cross rally doesn't always have to mean that it just results in a lower high. 2023, it did not result in a lower high, right? It took it out, and it went to a higher high. 2019, it resulted in a lower high. So I don't know exactly which one it's going to mimic. My guess is that it's going to do something somewhat different, because every time we look at anything, we can always tell that things played out in a slightly different way throughout different phases of the cycle. But I will say that, if Bitcoin does sort of continue this into the death cross and then it fades, keep in mind that September timeframe, there is often some type of unfavorable seasonality for Bitcoin, right? So that's important to remember. September on average is the worst month for Bitcoin. Not every September, I get in a lot of trouble last year because Bitcoin went up like a couple percent or something in September, but on average, it's the worst month for Bitcoin on average. So we'll see what happens this September, but I think it's important with these markets to try to be rational, be level-headed, because what I see on Twitter, and I know you probably have seen it too, is that every time Bitcoin goes into one of these rallies, everyone starts screaming and mocking people and laughing. And every time Bitcoin goes into one of these dumps, everyone keeps freaking out. But this whole pattern is something we've discussed all year long, right? That it is a slow grind. It is a sideways move with a slightly bearish bias until Bitcoin dominance, worked it in, hit 60%, right? That has been the view, right? A sideways move with a slightly bearish bias until Bitcoin dominance hits 60%. And I think we're on the way there. I think we are. So, the 50-day SMA, the 200-day SMA, they're closing in here at around $62,000. So if Bitcoin does go north of 60K and then finds itself back below 60K, a week or something later, just know that that's pretty standard stuff, because that's often what happens as death crosses arrive. And then you have to work out, is there a narrative, right? Is there something that, and really it's not even a narrative, it's just like, is there liquidity? Is there a reason that it can actually put in a higher high like 2023? Or are there enough sort of macroeconomic scares, like labor, but like the labor market, like inflation, to cause it to just put in a lower high and then go down even again? Which again, I mean, it's an exhausting move, right? I mean, these types of moves, I think, are probably the most brutal, right? Because no one's really right, right? I mean, like, no one's really right. If you think back for this whole move since March, right? I mean, the bears have sort of been right, but the market's not really giving them what they want either, right? So it's one of those things where it's brutal, it's grueling. The bulls want to go up, they want to break out of here. The bears want to break down, and the market basically says, too bad, to both sides. And you're just putting in lower highs and lower lows, and it's almost an identical thing we saw in 2019. The fundamentals, like the news, are there, right? I mean, again, this is why the narratives don't matter, right? The news doesn't matter. If you went to Bitcoin Nashville, I mean, there's a lot of hype. I mean, we had presidential candidates talking about Bitcoin. It still didn't stop Bitcoin from selling off from 70K to 49K, right? I mean, so that shows you that the news cycle does not always matter. And I remember saying to someone at the conference, I'm like, you basically have two presidential candidates. If Bitcoin still can't break out to new all-time highs, with that, then you're probably going to get a pretty aggressive move back to the downside, just like we got in 2019, right? That final lower low before you realize if it's a soft landing or a hard landing. So I just wanted to come out here, talk about this death cross that's coming up, talk about the implications of it. I always hate doing these videos about the death cross, because then people eat it up and they're like, oh, death cross, crazy stuff. But you should just watch the video and know that this is the most, it's always the most likely move into a death cross is the rally you're getting right now. It just is. That doesn't mean every single time, but usually that's what happens, right? You get rallies into death crosses. You can see one right here in the summer of 2021, right? You had the rally into the death cross. 2019, right? A rally into the death cross. 2023, same thing, right? Death cross, rally on up. So again, it is the most likely outcome. That's why I mentioned it on Monday, so that people could be prepared. The death cross is likely going to occur in the next day or two. I don't know exactly. I haven't really done the math on it to see exactly when it's going to occur, but I would say let's see what happens after it occurs. Does it just fade back down like 2019? Does it fade like 2023, but then still get back above the 50-day? And maybe that is sort of what to look for, because in 2019 it did get above the 50-day, but then it was unable to hold it as support. You see that? Unable to hold it as support. In 2023, it got above the 50-day, and then it came back down and held it as support. In 2021, though, it didn't even get above the 50-day going into that death cross rally. So again, I do think that and then the market still trended down for another month or so. So I think that 50-day SMA is going to be kind of that line in the sand that you're going to want to watch. Does Bitcoin get above it? And if it does it hold it as support? If it doesn't, then it's probably similar to 2021, where, it just kind of dies back down for another month and we try again, in October, which is also a perfectly valid path. If the market just stays kind of cool until October and then we get another go at it. That could also certainly happen. So keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on this 50-day SMA around $62,000. If Bitcoin gets above it, you're going to want to see Bitcoin hold it as support to invalidate yet another lower high, or at least have a chance to invalidate yet another lower high. If it can't hold it, or if it doesn't get above it, then you're likely, at the very least, you would be looking at potentially revisiting some of these lows. Because even in 2019, right, even if you assume that this whole move is already played out and the moving averages don't really matter, right, if the 50-day and the 200-day don't really matter, and we've already had this capitulation here, you can see that the market rallied up and then it came back down about 1 month later, okay, and then it finally got a stronger move back up. So that is also a perfectly valid outcome as well, right? Where it just kind of goes up, it fades back down, and then you get another move up in October. So I think there's a lot of ways to think about the market and to think about sort of like what is the most likely outcome, you know, going into death crosses and going into golden crosses, right? Going into golden crosses, normally you see a short-term dump. Going into death crosses, you normally see the pump. It just, what comes after that is going to be dependent on other factors that are outside of the cryptoverse's control, right? Macroeconomic stuff, labor market, inflation. That's what's probably going to dictate what comes next. Whether it is a continuation of what we saw in 2023, or if it's like what we saw back over here in 2019. So that's what I'm looking at. We'll talk about it some more in future videos. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We've got a lot of charts on there. We've got, risk management dashboard, tons of tools and strategies that you can use, not only for crypto, but stocks and other things as well, precious metals, etc. So make sure you guys check it out, lock and lower rate, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.